Look at that. The charity case is here. Robert Kline's voice cut through the auditorium like a blade. He didn't lower it. He didn't need to, since the school was paying for everything anyway. Get up there. Play something. Give us a little show. A few people laughed. Tyler Brooks didn't move right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost too quiet. I'll play, sir, if that's all right. Kline smirked. If that's all right, as if the boy had a choice. A large crowd watched. No one stood up for him. No one said a word. But here's what nobody in that room could have predicted. What Tyler did next didn't just silence the laughter. It ended a career. Yeah, nobody in that auditorium realized what was about to happen next. So let's start today's story. To understand what happened that evening, you have to understand where Tyler Brooks came from. Not the school, not the auditorium, not the polished marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. Where he actually came from. Tyler grew up on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where the grocery store closed early and the streetlights flickered, but nobody called to fix them. The apartment he shared with his mother had 2 bedrooms, one for her, one for him, and a kitchen so small that when Denise Brooks came home from her night shift, she had to turn sideways to get to the stove. She worked 2 jobs, the hospital orderly during the day, the cleaning service at night. She never complained about it. She just came home, took off her shoes by the door, and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her eyes closed like she was collecting herself before the next round. Tyler watched her do that every night. He never asked her to stop. He never told her he noticed. But he noticed everything. He was that kind of boy, quiet, observant, the kind of kid who remembered the names of people others forgot. The kind who held the elevator door and said thank you to the janitor and meant it. Teachers at his old school described him the same way year after year. Focused, mature, unusually composed for his age. What none of those reports mentioned was the music. It started when Tyler was young. Their neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Jenkins, had an old upright piano pushed against the wall of her living room. She never played it anymore. Her arthritis had taken that from her years ago. But she kept it tuned, kept it clean, and every time Tyler came over to help her carry groceries, he would stop in front of it, just stand there looking at it. One afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins told him to sit down and try. He did. He pressed one key, then another. Then he started finding patterns. The way certain notes wanted to follow others. The way a chord felt like something being resolved. Like a door finally swinging open. Mrs. Jenkins sat in her armchair and watched him for a while, without saying a word. When he finally stopped, she said, "Come back tomorrow." He came back every day after that. Mrs. Jenkins never formally taught him theory or technique. She just let him play, corrected him when something was structurally wrong, and pointed him toward recordings of Chopin. She let the music itself do the teaching. Before long, Tyler was playing hymns at their church on Sunday mornings. The congregation didn't talk during his offertory anymore. They listened. But the South Side didn't have conservatories. It didn't have private instructors who charged high fees. It had churches and community centers and a public school music program that got its budget cut when Tyler was in elementary school. So he adapted. Every Wednesday evening, after the church custodian unlocked the hall for choir rehearsal, Tyler would arrive early. He would sit at the old Baldwin upright in the corner, the one with the sticky middle C and the pedal that creaked, and practice until the choir director arrived and politely asked him to stop. That was all he had. It was enough to get him noticed. A volunteer coordinator from a citywide arts foundation heard him play at a church fundraiser when Tyler was young. She made some calls, Some time later, Tyler Brooks had a full scholarship to Belmont Preparatory Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Chicago. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Denise read it several times standing at the kitchen counter. Then she sat down. Then she read it again. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together, folded the letter carefully, and slid it back into the envelope. Then she looked at her son and said, "This is the door. What you do with it is yours." Tyler walked into Belmont that fall with one pair of dress shoes, a uniform that was slightly too large because Denise had bought it with room to grow into, and no illusions about what he was walking into. He knew the moment he stepped through the front entrance. The lobby smelled like fresh paint and money. The trophy cases stretched the length of the hallway. State championships, debate titles, Ivy League acceptances framed like artwork. Groups of students moved through the corridors with the easy confidence of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged. Tyler walked past all of it and found his locker. He didn't try to disappear, but he didn't push either. He did his work. He kept his grades up. He stayed out of situations that could jeopardize the scholarship. And there were situations, quiet ones, the kind that never made it into any official report. There was the time a group of boys in his history class laughed when he mispronounced a French word, and the teacher let it go without a word. There was the time a parent at a school event asked him if he was there for the catering. There was the time Robert Kline passed him in the hallway with a prospective family on a tour and gestured vaguely at Tyler while saying, "We have a very diverse student body," not to Tyler about Tyler, as if he were a feature of the building rather than a person inside it. Tyler never said anything, not because he was afraid, but because he understood something that took most adults decades to learn, that some battles weren't worth the cost of the war. The scholarship was more important than the argument. His mother was working 2 jobs so he could be in this building, and he was not going to be removed from it over someone else's smallness. But there was one place in Belmont where none of that calculus applied: the auditorium, specifically the Steinway concert grand that sat on the left side of the stage. It was never played. Not really. Students performed on it occasionally at showcases, tentatively, the way people touch something in a museum. Careful, performative, disconnected. The piano existed as furniture, as atmosphere, as a symbol of the kind of school Belmont wanted to be. Every time Tyler passed the auditorium, he slowed down. If the doors were open, he stopped. He never went in. He just stood at the threshold and looked at it the way he used to stand in front of Mrs. Jenkins' upright when he was young. He waited. For some time he waited. He practiced on Wednesday evenings at the church and learned pieces nobody at Belmont knew he was learning, and kept the music the way you keep something precious, quietly, privately, away from the hands of people who might not understand its value, including Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the piece he had been working on, the same piece that shortly before Tyler walked into that auditorium. His music teacher, Rebecca Ellis, had been practicing in her office, running the difficult passage over and over, her jaw tight, her hands refusing to cooperate, and had finally closed the piano lid and whispered to herself, "Not tonight." She didn't know Tyler had learned it. Nobody did. Robert Kline had been principal of Belmont Preparatory Academy for some time. In that time, he had shaken hands with city mayors, been photographed with state senators, and been quoted in the Chicago Tribune several times. Twice about educational excellence, once about school funding reform, and once in a feature about visionary leadership in private education that his assistant had framed and hung in the reception area outside his office. He had put it there himself. He just let her think it was her idea. That was the thing about Robert Kline. He was good at making people think things were their idea. He was tall, silver-haired, always in a press suit with the top button fastened. He walked the hallways of Belmont with the unhurried stride of a man who had never once worried about being in the wrong place. When he entered a room, he didn't announce himself. He simply waited half a beat, just long enough for the room to notice him. It always did. His staff described him as decisive. His board described him as effective. The parents of his wealthiest students described him as exactly the kind of man a school like Belmont needed. What none of them said, because none of them had reason to examine it, was that Robert Kline sorted people. Not consciously, not with malice he could name, but efficiently, automatically, the way a man sorts his mail. Important, unimportant, discard. And the criteria he used, the invisible weight he placed on certain things, had been calibrated by a lifetime of living in rooms where everyone looked like him, thought like him, came from where he came from. He never saw it as bias. He saw it as standards. Tyler Brooks had been at Belmont for some time, and in that time Robert Kline had learned exactly 3 things about him. He was on scholarship, he was quiet, and he sat in the back. That was enough information for Kline to have formed a complete picture. He had never asked Tyler's name. In hallway interactions, he referred to him as the scholarship kid, not cruelly the way a bully would, casually the way a man refers to furniture by its function. The chair by the window, the lamp by the door, the scholarship kid in the back row. The scholarship program itself was something Kline had inherited from the previous administration. He had never tried to eliminate it outright. That would have looked bad. But in every budget meeting for some time, he had quietly flagged it as a line item worth reassessing. He used words like sustainability and institutional fit. He never said what he meant. Everyone in those meetings understood what he meant. Sometime before the showcase, Kline had been standing in his office doorway talking to Philip Whitaker, the school board chair, when Tyler walked past in the corridor below. Kline had glanced down at the boy and said without lowering his voice, "The foundation keeps sending us these kids without thinking about whether they're actually ready for an environment like this." Whitaker had looked at him for a moment without responding. Kline hadn't noticed. That was the other thing about Robert Kline. He had spent so long being agreed with that he had lost the ability to read the room when the room disagreed. The showcase was his event. He planned it, approved the program, selected the venue layout, and personally reviewed the order of performances. It was attended by board members, prospective families, a handful of local journalists, and the kind of donors whose names appeared on buildings. It was, in other words, a performance. Not by the students, but by the school itself. And Robert Kline was its director. He had been in a good mood that evening. The string quartet had gone well. The spoken word piece had been polished. Everything was moving according to the program he had approved. Then Rebecca Ellis walked off the stage. Kline watched her from the side of the room, her face flushed, her hands clasped in front of her. The careful dignity of someone holding themselves together in public. He had clapped with everyone else. He had kept his expression neutral. But something had shifted in the room. A looseness, a slight deflation. The energy that had been building through the evening had developed a small, uncomfortable crack. Kline didn't like cracks. He looked around the auditorium quickly, the way a man scans for an opportunity, and his eyes landed on the back row. The boy in the worn uniform sitting alone. No parents beside him, no one next to him at all. Something clicked. Not a plan, an impulse. The kind that feels in the moment like cleverness and only reveals itself as cruelty in hindsight. He reached for the microphone. The microphone crackled once when Kline tapped it. The room settled. He smiled. The wide practice smile he used at donor dinners and ribbon cuttings, and let the silence sit for just a moment before he spoke. Well, that was a tough act to follow. polite laughter, the kind that fills space. But you know what I always say about Belmont? He paused, looked around the room with the satisfaction of a man surveying something he built. We are a community. Every single person in this building is part of what makes this school what it is. More applause, comfortable, rehearsed. And then he turned. Not toward the stage, not toward the faculty section, toward the back of the room, toward the single figure sitting alone in the last row, separated from the nearest cluster of students by 2 empty seats on either side. In fact, Kline's voice lifted, bright and carrying. I think we have one more performer tonight we haven't heard from yet. The room stirred. Tyler. He said the name the way you call a dog. No last name, no title, just the one word dropped into the air like something disposable. Our scholarship recipient. I've been told you have a thing for music. He hadn't been told anything. He didn't know anything about Tyler Brooks's relationship with music. He was performing generosity in front of the crowd, and the performance required a prop. The prop was the boy. Heads turned. The movement was almost choreographed, a slow, collective rotation toward the back row, like a field of sunflowers following light. Except there was no warmth in it, only weight. Tyler felt every single one of those eyes. He sat very still. In the third row, a cluster of boys from the junior class exchanged glances and smirked. One of them, a boy named Dylan, whose father sat on the scholarship selection committee, leaned toward his friend and said something behind his hand. His friend covered his mouth to keep from laughing out loud. A woman in the 5th row, pearls, navy blazer, the carefully maintained look of someone who lunched at the right places, raised her eyebrows and turned to the man beside her. Not in outrage, in anticipation. The way people look at a circus act before it begins. At the faculty table, Rebecca Ellis looked up sharply. She had just returned to her seat, still composing herself after the stage, and something about the scene in front of her made her go very still. Philip Whitaker, board chair, 3rd seat from the left in the front row, set down his pen. Kline wasn't finished. Come on up, son. The word son landed like a hand on the shoulder that wasn't asked for. Don't be shy. This is a safe space. Safe space. The words bounced off the marble walls of an auditorium that had never once felt safe to Tyler Brooks. He looked at the stage at the Steinway sitting under the lights, polished, waiting, enormous. He looked at Kline, who was holding one arm out toward the stage in a gesture of mock invitation. His smile patient and immovable and completely in control. He looked at the faces pointed at him like a single held breath, and he understood the trap perfectly. If he refused, if he shook his head, looked at the floor, retreated into the wordless apology of a boy who knew his place, Kline would thank him graciously and move on. And the room would exhale with the quiet satisfaction of an order confirmed. The scholarship kid couldn't do it. Of course he couldn't. What were we expecting? If he went up and played poorly, stumbled through something simple, hands shaking, notes wrong, it would be worse. It would follow him. It would become the story people told. Remember that night at the showcase when Kline called the scholarship boy up? And he completely fell apart, and Kline would shake his head with performative sympathy and say, he hadn't meant to put the boy on the spot. He just wanted to include everyone. He believed in this community, and everyone would believe him, because Robert Kline was very good at that. Tyler sat with all of this for a moment. In the front row, Dylan leaned forward, waiting. The pearl necklace woman tilted her head. The smirk on Kline's face held its shape, patient, certain, the expression of a man who already knew the ending. Then the narrator's voice drops almost to a whisper. That's how long Tyler Brooks had been learning the piece that Rebecca Ellis had walked off this very stage, unable to finish. He had been learning it alone on a creaking church piano on Wednesday evenings when no one was watching. Stay with this because what he does in the next moment doesn't just answer Kline's question. It dismantles everything Kline thought he knew. All right, let me ask you something real quick. You're a boy by yourself. The most powerful guy in the building just set you up in front of everyone. Whole room watching, and he's got that little smile like, yeah, this kid's done. So, be honest with me. You sitting back down, or you walking up there anyway? 'Cause I'm not gonna lie, that's a scary spot to be in. So yeah, what would you do? He gave himself a moment. Not because he was impulsive, because he had learned the hard way over his time at Belmont that the longer you hesitated in front of people like Robert Kline, the more the hesitation became the story, the more it confirmed what they had already decided about you before you opened your mouth. So that was the budget. In those moments, he thought about his mother, not in an abstract way, specifically. Denise Brooks lacing up her work shoes in the dark so she wouldn't wake him. Denise Brooks on the bus home at night, head against the window, eyes closed, too tired to hold them open. Denise Brooks standing at the kitchen counter, reading his scholarship letter several times, not crying, just pressing her lips together, folding the paper carefully like it was something that could break. This is the door. What you do with it is yours. He thought about Mrs. Jenkins's apartment, the upright piano against the wall. The afternoon he was young and pressed his first key and felt something open up inside him that he didn't have a word for yet. He thought about Wednesday evenings in the church hall, the sticky middle C, the creaking pedal, the time that were his and no one else's, no audience, no approval, no performance for anyone but himself, and the music and the empty room. The piece he had been working on, the left-hand passage, the one that had defeated Rebecca Ellis tonight, right here on this stage in front of these same people. He thought about all of it until the music wasn't something he was playing anymore, but something he was remembering. The way you remember a place you've been so many times. It lives inside your body. He thought about all of it. Then he stood up. He didn't look at the boys smirking in the third row. He didn't look at the pearl necklace woman. He didn't look at Kline's outstretched arm or his patient, certain smile. He walked toward the stage the way his mother walked into a long shift. Quietly, without drama, with the particular dignity of someone who has already decided that the difficulty of a thing is not a reason to avoid it. He reached the stage steps, climbed them, walked past the microphone without touching it, stopped in front of the Steinway, turned to Kline. His voice was level. "That Chopin piece Ms. Ellis was playing, sir?" A pause. "I know it. I'd like to try if that's all right." Kline blinked once, then he smiled. Broader now, more generous. The smile of a man granting a favor he was certain would embarrass the recipient. "By all means," he said, and gestured to the bench. He still thought he was in control. Tyler sat down at the Steinway. He didn't rush it. He adjusted the bench, slid it back half an inch, tested the distance with his arms, made one small correction. It was the kind of adjustment that takes a moment and communicates everything. This boy had done this before. Not on a piano like this one, but he had done this. The auditorium was quiet. In the way that large rooms get quiet when something unexpected is about to happen. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of held breath, of people suddenly uncertain what they were about to witness. Kline stood at the side of the stage, arms loosely folded, the posture of a man waiting for a mildly interesting thing to conclude. In the faculty section, Rebecca Ellis had not sat back down. She was standing at the edge of her row, one hand resting on the back of the chair in front of her, watching the boy at the piano, with an expression that hadn't settled into anything yet. Tyler placed his hands above the keys and stopped. He didn't play. Some time passed. The ventilation system in the ceiling became audible. Someone in the middle rows shifted in their seat, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor, and the sound carried all the way to the stage because everything else was still. Dylan in the third row leaned forward with a small smile, waiting for the fumble, waiting for the first wrong note, the hesitation, the visible collapse of a boy who had overreached. Kline glanced at the board members in the front row. A small, almost imperceptible look, the kind that says, "Watch this," without saying anything. Then Tyler's hands came down. Not at the beginning of the ballad, at the passage, the exact passage, the left-hand cascade that descended like water finding its level. Technically brutal, emotionally precise. The passage that Rebecca Ellis had stumbled over and abandoned. He didn't back up. He didn't ease into it from safer ground. He started there at the hardest point, the way you prove something, not by avoiding the difficulty, but by walking directly into it. The first notes hit the room like a change in air pressure. Not loud. The opening of that passage wasn't loud. It was dense, deliberate, each note placed with the weight of intention behind it. The left hand moved in a pattern that required the kind of independence between the hands that takes years to develop. The left doing one thing, the right doing another, both in conversation, neither subordinate to the other. It was technically flawless, but that wasn't what stopped the room. What stopped the room was that it didn't sound like a boy demonstrating technique. It sounded like someone who had lived inside this music for a long time. In the third row, Dylan's smile faded, not all at once. It dissolved slowly, the way ice does, without a clear moment of ending. He sat back in his seat. His friend, who had been half turned to share the joke, turned back to face the stage instead. The pearl necklace woman in the fifth row stopped tilting her head. She straightened her hands, which had been folded loosely in her lap, pressed together. Philip Whitaker picked up his pen, then set it back down. He wasn't going to be writing anything for a while. Rebecca Ellis took one step forward, just one, but it was involuntary. The way a person steps towards something they can't quite believe they're seeing. Her arms, which had been crossed since she returned to her seat, dropped to her sides. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone. Not to look at it, not to be distracted by it, but to open her notes application. Her fingers moved across the screen without looking down. She was writing something. Later. What she had written would turn out to be 4 words, left hand, completely clean. 4 words that meant nothing to most people in that room, and everything to anyone who understood what that passage demanded. Tyler moved through the opening and into the first theme, the lyrical melody that Chopin had written to carry above the turbulence of the left hand, like a voice staying steady in a storm. His right hand found it with the kind of ease that doesn't come from talent alone. It comes from repetition so deep it has become reflex from Wednesday evenings and sticky keys. The room was fully still now, not the polite stillness of an audience being patient, the involuntary stillness of people who have forgotten they were planning to have an opinion. Kline's arms had uncrossed. He was standing with his hands at his sides, his weight shifted slightly forward, his expression doing something it rarely did in public, failing to perform. The careful management of his face, the practiced readability of a man who always controlled what he showed, had developed a small fault line, not visible to most people in the room, but visible to Rebecca Ellis, who glanced at him once from across the stage and then looked back at the boy at the piano. The music built. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 is not a gentle piece. It moves in waves, lyrical sections that breathe and expand, followed by passages of escalating intensity. The emotional architecture of something that knows exactly where it is going and makes you feel the inevitability of it before you get there. In the hands of someone technically proficient but emotionally distant, it sounds impressive, correct, finished. In the hands of someone who has sat alone with it in a cold church hall on a Wednesday evening with no audience and no approval, and no reason to play it except that the music itself demanded to be understood, it sounds like the truth. That was what was happening in the auditorium of Belmont Preparatory Academy on that evening. The crowd was hearing the truth, and their bodies knew it before their minds could process it. A woman in the 7th row reached sideways and found her husband's hand without looking at him. He let her take it. A boy in the back, not far from where Tyler had been sitting, stopped typing on his phone and put it face down on his knee. Olivia Carter sat in the middle section with both hands pressed flat against her thighs, her jaw tight, her eyes bright. She had watched Tyler walk up to that stage alone. She had watched the smirking boys and the tilted heads, and Kline's performance of generosity. She had felt the particular sick feeling of watching something unfair happen in public and being powerless to stop it. That feeling was changing into something else. Now she didn't have a word for it yet. She would at later. The music moved into the development section, the part of the ballade where Chopin takes everything he has built and begins to fracture it systematically, theme against theme. The tension climbing in a way that feels almost unbearable, like a conversation where both people know what has to be said, and neither has said it yet. Tyler's tempo held. His dynamics were precise. The swells controlled, the quiet passages genuinely quiet, not tentative but intentional. This was not a boy playing as loud as he could manage. This was a musician making choices. In the front row, Whitaker leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. And then the music arrived at the place. The half-measure rest, the breath before the coda, the moment Chopin had built into the piece like a held inhale, a brief, devastating silence between the development and the final statement where everything stops and the listener hangs suspended, not knowing yet whether what comes next will resolve or destroy. Tyler reached it and he stopped, hands lifted from the keys. Silence. Some time passed. The ventilation system was audible again. Someone in the room made a soft sound. Not a word. Just the involuntary escape of breath from a person who had been holding it without realizing. Nobody moved. Kline stood completely still, and for the first time in his time at Belmont Preparatory Academy, Robert Kline had no idea what to do with his face. Then, Tyler's hands came back down. The coda arrived like a wave that had been building for a long time. All the Wednesday evenings, all the sticky keys, all the practice sessions in an empty church hall, when nobody was watching and nobody was grading and nobody was deciding whether he belonged. It arrived with the full weight of everything that had been quiet for some time at Belmont, everything that had been patient and composed and careful and strategic. And it was none of those things now. It was just the music. Full, thunderous, radiant completely itself. The applause started before the final phrase was finished. Not from one person, from several, simultaneously ragged at first. Individual hands finding each other, then coalescing into something unified and physical that rose through the auditorium like a change in weather. People were standing, not because they decided to, because they were already on their feet before the decision was made. And the pearl necklace woman was standing. The couple in the 7th row were standing, still holding hands. Whitaker was standing. The boy who had put his phone face down was standing. And he was doing something he would later be slightly embarrassed to admit. He was clapping over his head, the way you do when the body overtakes the self-consciousness. Dylan in the 3rd row stood last, but he stood. Tyler played the final chord, let it ring, lifted his hands from the keys, and placed them in his lap. He didn't turn around immediately. He sat with the silence for some time, the way a person sits after finishing something they have carried for a long time, not triumphant, not performing, just present in the way that people are present after something real has happened. Then he turned around and the room was standing, every single person. The applause didn't stop. It wasn't the polite, measured applause of a school showcase, the kind that lasts briefly and comes with a smile and a return to conversation. This was the other kind. The kind that has weight in it, the kind that keeps going because the people giving it aren't ready to let the moment end. Tyler sat at the piano and looked out at the crowd standing for him. He didn't pump his fist. He didn't grin. He sat very still, the way he had learned to sit through everything at Belmont, through the smirks, through the casual remarks, through some time of being looked past by the man now standing nearby, and he let the moment be what it was. Olivia Carter was crying. She wasn't trying to stop. She stood in the middle section with tears running down her face, clapping until her palms were red, and she didn't care who saw. The sick feeling from earlier, the helpless, furious feeling of watching something unfair happen in public, had broken open into something she didn't have a word for before that evening. She had one now. Justice. Rebecca Ellis walked to the edge of the stage. She didn't rush. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone who understood the weight of a gesture. When she reached the railing, she stopped, and she raised both hands above her head and clapped. Not the restrained applause of a faculty member being appropriately encouraging, but the full, open-palmed applause of one musician acknowledging another, hands above the head, unhesitating. In the professional world she came from, that gesture meant something specific. It was not given lightly. It was not given to students as a rule. She gave it to Tyler Brooks without hesitation. Whitaker in the front row had stopped clapping. He was watching the stage with a stillness that was different from the stillness of being moved by music. It was the stillness of a man making a mental note, precise, purposeful, that would have consequences later. And Robert Kline was applauding. He had no choice. The crowd was watching him the way they always watched him, as the person who set the tone, the one whose reaction told them how to calibrate their own. If he stood with his arms folded, the room would see it. If he walked away, the room would see that too. So he clapped. But his hands moved without energy. The mechanical rhythm of a man going through a motion his body had agreed to without consulting his conviction. The smile, the wide, practiced donor dinner smile, was present, but the infrastructure behind it had collapsed. The eyes weren't doing the right thing. Anyone paying close attention could see it. Whitaker was paying close attention as the applause began to settle, as people lowered back into their seats, and the particular electricity of the moment started its slow conversion into memory. Kline moved toward the piano. He straightened his jacket. He extended his hand toward Tyler with the recovering grace of a man who had spent his time being the most important person in every room he entered. "Well," he said, his voice low, pitched for just the two of them. That was something else. Tyler looked at the hand, then at the man. He shook it, held eye contact in a way that Kline had never once experienced from a student. Not defiant, not aggressive, not performing for the audience, just steady. The particular steadiness of someone who no longer needed anything from the person in front of them. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir." 7 words, quiet enough that only the people nearest the stage could hear them. Kline opened his mouth, then closed it, because there was nothing to say. The boy had thanked him graciously with perfect composure in front of everyone. And somehow that was the most devastating thing of all. Olivia Carter, watching from the middle section, exhaled slowly. He said something to him. She whispered to the girl beside her. What did he say? Olivia watched Kline's face for a moment. I don't know, she said. But look at him. Tyler walked off the stage the same way he had walked on, quietly, without drama. The particular composure of someone who had decided a long time ago that the way you carry yourself in difficult moments is the only thing that actually belongs to you. He was halfway down the side steps when he saw her. Denise Brooks was standing at the back of the auditorium near the double doors, still in her work uniform, pale blue top, dark pants, non-slip shoes, her hospital badge still clipped to her collar, her keys still in her hand. She hadn't had time to change. A colleague had texted her during her shift. Your son is doing something tonight at that school. You should come. Denise had read it once, gone straight to her supervisor, and asked to leave early, something she had done once before. Her supervisor looked at her face and said yes without asking why. She took the bus, walked several blocks, hurried the last part. She had arrived in time to hear the final part of the ballade. She didn't know the piece by name. She didn't need to. She knew the sound of her son playing, the quality of his touch, the way he breathed when he was deep inside music. And she had stood at the back of that room and understood without needing it, explained exactly what was happening. She had not made a sound. She just stood there, keys in hand, and watched the crowd rise to their feet for her boy. Now, Tyler was at the bottom of the steps. He saw her. He stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. The boy at the center of everything. The woman at the back of the room. The space between them full of everything that didn't need to be said. Then he walked to her through the crowd still buzzing around him. People reaching out to touch his shoulder. Faces turned toward him with expressions he had never once seen directed at him inside this building. He reached his mother. She didn't speak. She put her arms around him, keys still in her hand, the cold metal pressing lightly against his back, and held on. Tyler closed his eyes. He had not cried at the piano, not when the room stood, not when Kline shook his hand and couldn't find words. He had been composed through all of it, the practiced steadiness of a boy who had learned early that composure was its own kind of armor. But this was his mother in her work uniform, who had taken the bus and walked blocks and hurried just for a moment in the back of the room. He let go. He was young, and his mother had come. David Garrett had arrived at the showcase, planning to write a short piece about Belmont's arts program. He left with something else. His piece ran soon after. Principal called him up to embarrass him. The boy played Chopin better than the music teacher. It had been shared widely. A concert pianist with a large following had reposted it with 4 words. Find this kid, please. It spread far. Musicians identified the passage Tyler had opened with and explained its technical demands in language most people couldn't follow, but everyone understood the gravity of. Teachers shared it. Parents shared it. People who had never heard of Chopin shared it because what they were watching didn't require musical knowledge to understand. It was just a boy being underestimated, answering with everything he had. That was a language everyone spoke. Sometime later, a letter arrived at the Brooks apartment on the south side. Not at Belmont, not through Kline's office or the Scholarship Foundation. Directly to Denise Brooks at her home address. Return address, Lakeshore Arts Academy, Northern Michigan. Denise opened it at the kitchen table, still in her coat. Read it once, sat down, read it again. Full scholarship, room and board, pre-professional piano training under faculty whose students now performed at Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall beginning in the fall. She set the letter down and called Tyler in from his room. He stood in the doorway. She slid the letter across the table without a word. He read it again, looked at his mother. Denise had not cried when the Belmont scholarship arrived some time ago, had not cried at the back of the auditorium that evening. She had held her keys and held her son and held herself together the way she always did. She wasn't crying now either, but her voice had something in it Tyler had only heard a handful of times. A particular roughness, the sound of a woman who has kept something contained for a very long time and is finally carefully setting it down. "I told you," she said. "Don't hide what God gave you in the dark." Tyler looked at the letter, then at her. "I'll need a better piano to practice on." Denise stared at him for one full second. Then she laughed, sudden, full, unguarded. The laugh of a woman who has been holding her breath for years and has finally completely been given permission to stop. Sometime after the showcase, the Belmont board held an emergency session. Philip Whitaker had called it. Kline arrived prepared to manage the situation. He had a statement ready, a framing strategy, the practiced vocabulary of institutional leadership, context, community, misunderstanding. Whitaker let him finish. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A transfer effective end of term, district administrative advisory role. A title long enough to sound important, transparent enough that everyone in the room understood exactly what it was. Kline looked at the paper, then at Whitaker. Whitaker didn't look away. Kline signed. He never stood at a Belmont microphone again. The scholarship program he had spent some time quietly trying to defund received a budget increase, approved unanimously at the same meeting. Whitaker's pen moving across the page with the quiet satisfaction of a correction long overdue. Sometime later, Northern Michigan, late afternoon. The practice room was small and warm, with a single window that faced west. The light came through it at an angle that turned everything gold. The music stand, the worn wood of the bench, the keys of the Steinway that Tyler had been sitting at for some time. He was working on Beethoven now. The Appassionata, a different kind of difficulty. Not the lyrical turbulence of Chopin, but something harder, more architectural, like trying to hold a storm inside a structure and make it obey. He was getting there. His phone buzzed on top of the piano. A message from his mother. No words, just a photograph. Denise Brooks sitting at the kitchen table on the south side. Laptop open. The screen showing a slightly shaky video filmed on a stranger's phone. The auditorium. The Steinway. A boy adjusting the bench. She had watched it again. Below the photo, 3 words. "So proud, baby." Tyler looked at the message for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the piano, turned back to the keys, and played. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a speech or a declaration. It doesn't demand an audience. It looks from the outside like a boy standing up from a back row seat and walking toward a stage, quietly, without drama, the way his mother walked into a long shift. Tyler Brooks didn't walk up to that piano to prove something to Robert Kline. He walked up because the music was his and no one's contempt, however public, however confident, however backed by institutional authority, could make it less so. What happened next wasn't a miracle. It was a preparation meeting for the moment it had been waiting for. All right, let me say this real quick. Yeah, the story about Tyler, that part's made up. But that feeling he had in that room, man, that's real as hell. People looking right past you, talking like you're not even there, like you don't belong. That kind of stuff happens every day. Sometimes the loudest voices in the room are the ones that have never truly been tested. They assume the quiet kid in the back row has nothing to offer, that where he came from automatically decides what he's capable of. But real courage doesn't shout. It doesn't need permission or applause to exist. It simply stands up when the moment comes, walks forward with steady hands and a heart full of quiet preparation, and lets the truth speak for itself. Tyler Brooks didn't play that piano to prove anyone wrong. He played because the music had always belonged to him, no matter how many people looked past him or tried to shrink his place in the world. In those few minutes, a boy from a small South Side apartment reminded every person in that elegant auditorium what dignity, resilience, and hidden talent really look like. He showed us that the doors life opens for us matter far less than what we choose to do once we step through them. And sometimes the greatest revenge against doubt isn't anger. It's excellence delivered with grace. Never let anyone convince you that your beginnings limit your endings. Keep practicing in the quiet places. Keep showing up. Keep believing that your moment will come, even if no one in the room sees it yet. Because one day, when they least expect it, you'll rise, and the whole room will have no choice but to stand. If this story touched something deep inside you, drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever been underestimated because of where you came from? How did you respond? Your story might inspire someone else who's quietly fighting the same battle right now. And if you want more powerful, heartfelt stories like this every week, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep reminding each other what we're truly capable of. See you in the next one.